For centuries, naval battles were fought by daylight. Admirals planned their engagements around the sun, waiting for dawn, or racing to finish before dusk. Night was a sanctuary. A pause. A time when even the mightiest warships became blind giants, drifting cautiously, listening for the sounds of engines, the wash of waves against an unseen hull. In the blackness, a sailor's eyes were his only compass. But eyes, even the sharpest, could see so little. A shadow. A silhouette against the stars. Perhaps the faint glow of a wake, churning phosphorescence in the water. Japan's Imperial Navy understood this darkness well. Their sailors trained endlessly in night combat, sharpening their vision, learning to read the sea by feel and sound. They practiced firing star shells, flares that burst high above the water, casting brief, ghostly light over friend and foe alike. In those fleeting seconds, gunners would aim, calculate, and fire. But then the flare would fall, and the darkness would return. It was a kind of dance. A gamble. Whoever saw first, won. By 1942, the Pacific War had become a vast chessboard of islands and atolls, and much of the fighting happened at night. Japan's navy had earned a fierce reputation. They moved like shadows. They struck fast. And they vanished before dawn. The Americans, by contrast, felt vulnerable in the dark. Their ships were powerful, thick armor, heavy guns, but in the blackness of a moonless night, power meant little. You cannot hit what you cannot see. And so, quietly, desperately, American engineers had been working on something new. Something that would change everything. It began with a strange device. Boxy. Humming. Mounted on the mast of a ship. It looked almost unfinished. Wires and dials and spinning antennas. Sailors joked about it. Some called it the contraption. Others didn't trust it at all. But the engineers knew what it could do. It could see through the dark. Not with light. Not with flares. But with invisible pulses, radio waves, bouncing off steel hulls miles away, returning with whispers of distance and direction. Radar. The word itself was new. Few sailors even understood how it worked. But in the hands of a trained operator, hunched over a glowing green screen, it turned night into day. And in November 1942, during a chaotic, desperate clash near Guadalcanal, the Japanese Navy would encounter this technology, for the first time. They would sail into battle confident, experienced, ready for the familiar chaos of night combat. And they would be met with something impossible. Shells, landing with eerie precision. From guns they could not see. Fired by ships hidden in total darkness. And in that moment, the old rules dissolved like mist. Somewhere in the black waters of the Pacific, the future had arrived. And the night would never feel the same again. Guadalcanal. Even the name sounds heavy, weighed down with heat and rain and mud. By the autumn of 1942, this small island in the Solomon chain had become the center of everything. American Marines clung to a sliver of coastline. Japanese forces held the jungle. And every night, supply convoys raced down from the north, trying to reinforce, resupply, survive. The waters around Guadalcanal were narrow. Dangerous. Dotted with reefs and smaller islands. The kind of place where ships moved carefully, even in daylight. At night, it became a maze. The Japanese called their supply runs the Rat Run. Fast destroyers and cruisers, slipping down under cover of darkness, unloading troops and ammunition, then racing back before American planes could catch them at dawn. It was exhausting. Tense. But it worked. Until it didn't. On the night of November 12th, the sea was calm. The air hung thick and warm. No moon. No stars. Just blackness, and the distant growl of engines. The Japanese knew the Americans were near. They always were. But night fighting was Japan's specialty. Their sailors had done this 100 times. They knew how to read the water, how to move without being seen. And so they sailed forward, confident. What they didn't know was that this time, they were already being watched. Aboard the American ships, battleships and cruisers anchored near the island, radar operators sat in dim red-lit rooms, staring at circular screens. The screens glowed faintly green. And on them, little blips appeared. Contacts. Ships. Moving south. Miles away. Still invisible to the naked eye. But clear as daylight on the radar. The officers studied the screens. Calculated speed. Bearing. Distance. And then, they gave the order. Prepare to fire. On deck, the big guns swung slowly into position. Massive turrets, each barrel as long as a bus, aimed into the darkness. The gun crews loaded shells, each one taller than a man, each one capable of tearing through steel like paper. But there was nothing to see. No target. No flare. Just the black sea, and the invisible coordinates whispered up from the radar room below. The Japanese ships sailed closer. Unaware. In the old way of fighting, this would have been the moment for star shells. For searchlights. For frantic scanning of the horizon. But the Americans did none of that. They simply waited. And then, on command, they fired. The night exploded. Flames roared from the barrels. The concussion rippled across the water. The shells screamed into the darkness, each one guided not by sight, but by numbers. Angles. Calculated positions. And seconds later, miles away, the shells found their marks. Explosions bloomed in the black. Steel shrieked. Water erupted. The Japanese sailors barely had time to react. One moment, they were gliding through safe darkness. The next, their ships were being hammered by fire they couldn't trace. No searchlights. No flares. No warning. Just shells, arriving out of nowhere. It felt unnatural. As if the sea itself had turned against them. And in the chaos, the confusion, the impossible accuracy, Japan's confidence began to crack. The battle raged on through the night. Ships twisted and maneuvered. Fires burned on the water. Men shouted. Metal screamed. But beneath it all, a realization was forming. The Americans could see in the dark. And the night was no longer Japan's ally. Let's go below deck for a moment. Down a narrow ladder, through a hatchway, into a small, cramped compartment lit only by the soft red glow of instrument lights. This is the Combat Information Center. The CIC. It smells like oil and sweat and electric warmth. The air hums with the sound of machinery, radar sets spinning, circuits clicking, cooling fans whirring softly. At the center of the room, a circular screen. It looks almost like a clock face. A dark green disk, swept by a thin line of light rotating slowly around and around. And wherever that line passes, tiny bright dots appear. Contacts. Each dot is a ship. Each flicker, a piece of steel reflecting back the invisible pulses sent out by the radar antenna high above. The radar operator sits hunched over the screen, one hand on a dial, adjusting the sensitivity. His face is calm. Focused. He's been trained for this. Hours and hours in a mock-up room, learning to read the screen, to distinguish between a rain cloud and a warship, between clutter and threat. Now, in the real dark, his skill matters more than ever. He marks a contact, measures its bearing, calls out the numbers. An officer jots them down, calculates speed, projects where the enemy will be, in 1 minute, in 5. Upstairs, on the bridge, another officer receives the information. He doesn't question it. Doesn't ask, "Are you sure?" The radar has been right too many times. He relays the data to the gunnery officer. And the guns turn toward a target no one can see. This is the magic, and the strangeness of radar. It requires trust. Trust in technology. Trust in invisible waves bouncing off distant steel. Trust that the numbers are real, even when your eyes see only darkness. For many sailors, this was hard. The sea had always been a place of instinct, of experience, of looking and listening and feeling the wind. But now, the most important sense was electronic. The Japanese, skilled as they were, had no such advantage. Their ships carried optical rangefinders, beautifully engineered instruments with long, precise lenses. In daylight they were superb. But at night, they were nearly useless. Japan had experimented with radar. They knew it existed. But their sets were crude, unreliable, and few ships carried them. Most commanders still trusted their eyes, their instincts, their years of experience. And so, on that November night, they sailed into a fight, unaware that they were already illuminated. Not by light, but by invisible waves. In the radar room, the operator watched the contacts move closer. His voice stayed calm. Professional. He might have been reading a weather report. But his hands were steady. The officers around him worked quickly. Plotting. Calculating. Feeding information upward. It was a new kind of warfare. Quiet. Cerebral. A battle fought with numbers before it was fought with shells. And when the guns finally fired, it was with a certainty that no night battle had ever known before. The Japanese couldn't understand it. Couldn't see the invisible net that surrounded them. To them, it felt like sorcery. Like the Americans had somehow tamed the night itself. In a way, they had. And down in the CIC, beneath the chaos of the battle above, the radar kept spinning. Sweep. 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 Each rotation, a heartbeat. Each contact, a story. And the green glow, steady and calm, like a lantern in the dark. Let's linger on a single shell. Imagine it. A steel projectile. 14 inches across. Weighing as much as a small car. Nestled in the breech of a massive gun, waiting. Around it, sailors work and practice rhythm. Loading powder. Closing the breech. Stepping back. The gun captain raises his hand. Waits for the order. And then it comes. Fire. The gun roars. The recoil shakes the ship. The shell leaps into the air, arcing up and out, into the black. Now, here's the miracle. That shell doesn't fly straight. It rises, carried by the explosive force, then curves downward, pulled by gravity. It travels miles. Through wind. Through air that shifts and swirls. And somehow, impossibly, it lands, exactly where it was meant to. How? Mathematics. For centuries, gunners relied on line of sight. They aimed at what they could see. And even then, hitting a moving target at sea was nearly impossible. The ship rolled. The target weaved. Shells splashed harmlessly into the waves. But radar changed the equation. Suddenly, gunners had precise information. Distance to target. Bearing. Speed. Even rate of turn. Feed those numbers into a mechanical computer. Yes, mechanical, full of gears and dials and spinning wheels, and out comes a firing solution. A precise angle. A precise moment. The guns adjust automatically. Hydraulics hiss. Turrets rotate. And then, the order. Fire. It's not guesswork anymore. It's geometry. And the Japanese, who had spent years perfecting the art of night combat, suddenly found themselves outmatched, not by courage or skill, but by calculation. In the chaos of battle, this was hard to grasp. Explosions. Smoke. Shouted orders. Fire reflected on dark water. It all felt like madness. But underneath, there was order. Cold. Precise. Mathematical. The Americans didn't need to see their enemy. They only needed the numbers. And the numbers were always there. The Japanese tried to adapt. They maneuvered sharply, zigzagged, launched torpedoes, long, deadly fish that raced through the water, hoping to find American hulls. Some hit. Ships were damaged. Men were lost. But the balance had shifted. Every time the Japanese moved, the radar saw it. Every time they fired, the radar tracked the flash. And the American guns responded. Not wildly. Not frantically. But methodically. One salvo. Then another. Shells falling in tight patterns, straddling the target, correcting, closing in. It was relentless. And for the Japanese sailors, it was terrifying. Because they couldn't fight back against something they couldn't see. They couldn't outmaneuver mathematics. In the histories written afterward, this battle would be called a turning point. The moment when technology tilted the balance. When radar proved its worth. But in that moment, on those dark waters, it was simply survival. Japanese ships burned. Limped away. Sank. American ships, too, took damage. Radar didn't make them invincible. It made them better. And that was enough. As the night wore on, the fighting ebbed. Ships withdrew. The sea grew quiet again. The darkness remained. But now, the darkness felt different. Less like a cloak. More like a stage, lit by invisible eyes. And somewhere in that black expanse, a Japanese officer stood on his bridge, staring into nothing, trying to understand what had just happened. He couldn't see the radar beams. Couldn't hear the calculations. Couldn't know the precise choreography of mathematics and machinery that had unfolded around him. All he knew was that the night had betrayed him. And that the Americans had learned to see where there was no light. Now, let's step away from the machines. Away from the screens and the calculations. And listen to the sailors. Because technology, no matter how advanced, is only as real as the people who use it. On the American ships, sailors had mixed feelings about radar. Some were amazed. They'd seen it work, watched contacts appear on the screen, then watched shells land right where the screen said they would. It felt like magic. Like seeing the future. But others were uneasy. War, for them, had always been something tangible. Something you could see and hear and feel. The roar of guns. The flash of explosions. The smell of cordite and smoke. But radar was silent. Invisible. Abstract. You couldn't touch it. Couldn't watch it work. You simply had to trust that somewhere below deck, a green screen was telling the truth. And that was hard. Especially for the older sailors. The ones who'd learned to fight by instinct. Who could read the sea like a book. Who trusted their eyes above all else. One gunner years later would describe it like this. It felt like firing blind. We'd aim at nothing. Just empty black. And then we'd hear the hit. And it was the strangest feeling. Like the sea was haunted. But slowly, trust built. Because the radar kept working. Again. And again. And the skeptics became believers. On the Japanese side, the experience was entirely different. Their sailors didn't know about radar. Didn't understand what was happening. All they knew was that they were being hit. In the dark. From impossible distances. With impossible accuracy. Some thought the Americans had developed a new kind of night vision. That they'd somehow trained their eyes to see in pure blackness. Others thought it was luck. A fluke. That the Americans had simply guessed right. But as the battles continued, over weeks, over months, it became clear. This wasn't luck. This was something new. Japanese intelligence officers interrogated captured American sailors. They examined wreckage. They tried to piece together the puzzle. And slowly they learned. Radar. The word itself became a kind of ghost. whispered in wardrooms, studied in reports. Japan scrambled to develop their own systems, to catch up. But by then, the gap had already widened. And the psychological impact was profound. Imagine being a sailor, trained to fight at night, confident in your skills, only to discover that your enemy can see you when you cannot see them. It's disorienting, demoralizing. It changes how you move, how you think. You second-guess every decision. Do we advance? Do we retreat? Are they watching us right now? The darkness, once a shield, becomes a trap. And that fear, that uncertainty, is as powerful as any weapon. In the years that followed, radar would become standard. Ubiquitous. Every navy would have it. The advantage would fade. But in 1942, in those dark waters off Guadalcanal, it was revelation. A glimpse of the future. And for the men who experienced it, on both sides, it was unforgettable. The Americans would remember it as the night they learned to trust the machines. The Japanese would remember it as the night the darkness turned against them. And somewhere between those two memories lies the truth. That war, like everything else, changes. That the old ways give way to the new. And that the sea, ancient and timeless as it is always, always shaped by the hands and minds of those who sail it. And the night goes on. Behind every battle, there are invisible hands. The hands of engineers, inventors, tinkerers, people who work in laboratories and workshops far from the sea, far from the sound of guns. Radar didn't appear overnight. It was born from decades of experimentation. From physicists playing with radio waves. From military officers imagining, what if? What if we could bounce a signal off a plane? Off a ship? What if we could measure how long it took to return? What if we could turn that measurement into distance? It sounded impossible. And for a long time, it was. Early radar sets were huge. Fragile. Temperamental. They broke down constantly. They couldn't distinguish between a ship and a rain cloud. They required specialists to operate. But slowly, piece by piece, the technology improved. In Britain, engineers refined the design. In America, they scaled it up. Built it smaller. Made it rugged enough for the chaos of a warship. And then, in secret, they installed it. Most sailors had no idea what the strange new antennas were for. Some thought they were new radio masts. Others assumed they were experimental, and probably useless. But the officers knew. And they waited for the right moment. That moment came at Guadalcanal. And when the guns fired, accurately, impossibly, in total darkness, it was vindication. For every engineer who had spent sleepless nights troubleshooting circuits. For every physicist who had calculated signal reflections on a chalkboard. For every skeptical admiral who had finally, reluctantly, agreed to give it a try. They weren't on the ships. They didn't hear the shells. Didn't see the explosions. But they'd made it possible. And in the quiet rooms where they worked, when the reports came back, they must have felt a strange kind of pride. Because they had changed warfare. Not with bigger guns. Not with thicker armor. But with understanding. With the patient, painstaking work of bending invisible waves to human will. It's easy to forget, in the drama of battle, that war is also a story of tools. Of creation. Of people trying to solve problems, one equation at a time. Radar was one of those tools. And like all tools, it was morally neutral. It could protect. It could destroy. It simply worked. And in the hands of skilled operators, it worked beautifully. Over the years, radar would evolve. It would detect aircraft, guide missiles, map weather, explore space. But in 1942, its job was simpler. See the enemy before they see you. And give your guns a target. That's all. But that was everything. The engineers who built it didn't think in terms of glory. They thought in terms of frequency, range, signal strength. They argued over antenna designs, worried about interference, calibrated sensitivity. And in doing so, they gave the sailors a gift. The gift of sight. In the one place where sight had always failed. In the dark. And that gift changed the course of the war. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic moment. But quietly. Steadily. Like the slow rotation of a radar beam. Sweeping across the black. Again. And again. And again. Until the darkness was no longer dark, but filled with invisible light. And the sea was no longer a mystery, but a map, drawn in phosphorescent green, on a glowing screen, in a room, below the deck, where the engineers work, became the sailors' eyes. Let's drift into the invisible. Imagine a wave. Not a wave of water, but a wave of energy. A ripple in the electromagnetic field. Traveling at the speed of light. Passing through air. Through clouds. Through darkness. You can't see it. Can't hear it. Can't feel it. But it's there. Radio waves. They surround us constantly. Always have. Cosmic radiation from distant stars. Lightning discharges. The hum of the Earth's magnetic field. But humans didn't understand them until the late 1800s, when scientists like Heinrich Hertz began experimenting, sending signals across a room, proving that invisible waves could carry information. It was a revolution. Radio. Wireless communication. Voices traveling without wires. By the early 1900s, ships at sea were using radio to communicate, sending Morse code across oceans, calling for help when storms struck. But it was still just communication. A way to send words. Then someone asked, what if we didn't just send a signal? What if we listened for its echo? Because radio waves, like sound waves, bounce. They reflect off objects. Off metal. Off anything solid. And if you sent a pulse, and listened carefully, you could measure the time it took to return. And from that time, calculate distance. It was elegant. Beautiful, even. And terrifyingly powerful. Because it meant you could detect something without seeing it. You could find a ship in fog. An aircraft in clouds. An enemy in the dark. All you needed was the right equipment. And patience. And the willingness to trust the invisible. The radar antenna spins slowly, sweeping the horizon, sending out pulses, thousands per second, each one racing outward at the speed of light. Most of them vanish into space, lost in the vastness. But some hit something. Steel. A ship's hull. The flat surface of a mast. And when they do, they bounce back. Just a whisper. A faint echo. But enough. The receiver catches it. Amplifies it. Displays it on the screen. A blip. Small. Fragile. Flickering. But real. And in that blip is everything. Distance. Direction. Speed. A story told in microseconds. A story invisible to the human eye, but clear to the machine. And the machine never blinks. Never gets tired. Never doubts. It simply listens for the whisper of radio waves bouncing back from the dark. This is the quiet miracle of radar. Not flashy. Not dramatic. Just reliable. And in war, reliability is everything. The Japanese didn't have this. Not yet. Not in any meaningful way. And so they sailed through a sea full of whispers, unable to hear them. while the Americans listened, and understood, and acted. It's strange, isn't it? How something so abstract, so invisible, can change everything. How a wave, either solid nor liquid, either light nor sound, can mean the difference between hitting your target and missing, between surviving and sinking, between winning and losing. The sailors didn't need to understand the science. They only needed to trust it. And slowly, they did. And the radar kept spinning, sweeping, listening, for the faint, impossible whisper of something out there, in the dark, and finding it again, and again, and again, until the darkness was full of light, invisible light, but light, all the same. Dawn came slowly, as it always does, over the ocean. First, a faint gray line on the horizon, then a wash of pale blue, then gold, spreading across the water like oil. The night's battle was over. The sea was calm again, almost peaceful. But the evidence remained. Oil slicks, debris, lifeboats drifting, the smell of smoke still hanging in the air. On the American ships, sailors emerged onto the deck, blinking in the light, exhausted, relieved. They looked out at the water and saw what they had hit. Wreckage, listing hulls, ships half sunk, their bows pointing at the sky. Some men felt satisfaction, pride. Others felt uneasy, because in daylight, the enemy looked human again. Not blips on a screen, not coordinates, but ships and men. War is easier in the abstract, when the enemy is invisible, when they're just numbers, just targets. But dawn brings reality, and reality is harder. On the Japanese side, the losses were devastating. Ships sunk, men lost, supplies gone, and more than that, confidence shaken. Because they didn't just lose a battle, they lost certainty. The certainty that night was their domain, that their training, their experience, their skill, would always be enough. But now they knew it wasn't. The Americans had something new, something they couldn't match, and the implications were staggering. Reports were filed, officers gathered, debriefs began, and through it all, one word kept coming up: radar. They needed to understand it, counter it, develop their own. But that would take time. And in war, time is everything. Meanwhile, aboard the American ships, the mood was different. There was exhaustion. Yes. Loss. Yes. But also proof. Proof that the technology worked. That radar wasn't just theory. Wasn't just hopeful speculation. It was real. And it was decisive. The officers who had doubted it stopped doubting. The sailors who had feared it started to trust. And the engineers, far away in their workshops, began working on the next version. Because technology never stops. It iterates, improves, evolves. And radar was just beginning. As the sun climbed higher, the ships began to move. Damage control teams worked. Fires were extinguished. Wounded were tended to. The sea, indifferent as always, rocked them gently. And somewhere beneath the surface, lost ships settled into the silt. Their stories unfinished. Their sailors gone. War is like that. It gives and takes. It reveals and obscures. It changes everything. But the sea remains. As it was before the battle. As it will be, long after. And the dawn light falls on the water. The same as it always has. Soft. Golden. Calm. as if nothing had happened at all. But something had. The night before, in total darkness, warfare had changed, and the men who lived through it would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. That the darkness could be pierced, that the invisible could be seen, and that technology, for better or worse, had opened a door to a new kind of war. Quieter, more precise, more mechanical. And as they sailed on into the morning, they must have wondered what would come next? What other invisible things might become visible? What other certainties might crumble? The sea gave no answers. It never does. But the sun kept rising, and the ships kept moving, and the war continued, as wars do, until they don't. Let's step back now, away from the ships, away from the water, and think about what this moment meant, not just for the war, but for history. Because the night Japan was stunned by radar was really a turning point in how humans fight, how we see, how we understand the world. For thousands of years, we relied on our senses: eyes, ears, touch. We built tools to extend them: telescopes, megaphones, measuring rods. But we were always limited by light, by distance, by the physical world. Radar changed that. It gave us a sense we never had before: the ability to perceive the invisible. And once you can perceive something, you can measure it, map it, control it. After the war, radar spread everywhere: air traffic control, weather forecasting, astronomy. It helped planes land in fog, helped meteorologists track storms, helped scientists discover that the universe was expanding, all from the same principle: send a signal, listen for the echo, measure the return. Simple, but transformative. And it all began with a military need to see the enemy in the dark. That's often how technology evolves. War drives innovation. Necessity sharpens ingenuity. And the tools of war become the tools of peace. Radar is one of those tools. Born in secrecy, tested in battle, and then released into the world. To serve, to protect, to explore, but also to surveil, to track, to control. Because every tool is double-edged. And the question is never, can we build it? But rather, should we? And if we do, how will we use it? These are old questions. As old as the first sharpened stone, the first fire, the first wheel. And they never go away. They simply change form. In 1942, the question was simple: can we win this battle? And radar answered, yes. But the deeper question: what kind of world are we creating? That question remained, and remains. Still. Because the world we live in today is full of invisible signals. Wi-Fi, GPS cell towers, satellites, all descendants of that first radar pulse. All part of a web we can't see, but that shapes everything. We trust it, rely on it, can't imagine life without it. Just like those sailors eventually trusted the radar screen, even when their eyes saw only darkness. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that technology is good or bad, but that it changes us, changes how we perceive, how we think, how we trust. And once that change happens, there's no going back. The sailors who fought at Guadalcanal went home. Most of them. They grew old, had families, told stories, and sometimes, late at night, They'd remember the darkness, the explosions, the impossible accuracy, and they'd shake their heads. Because even decades later, it still felt unreal, like something from a dream or a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was history. The night, the darkness, was pierced. And warfare was never the same. And neither were they. And the echoes of that night still ripple through the technology we carry, the systems we trust, the invisible networks that surround us. All of it traces back to a small screen, glowing green, in a darkened room, on a ship, in the Pacific, in 1942, when the invisible became visible, and the night was no longer safe. And so, we come to the end. Not of the story. Stories like this never truly end. But of our time together, tonight. Let's rest here, for a moment, and think about legacy. What does it mean, for something to last? The ships from that battle are gone now. Rusted. Broken. Resting on the ocean floor. The sailors have passed on. Their voices, silent. But the idea of seeing in the dark, that remains. It lives in every radar station, every air traffic control tower, every weather satellite. It lives in the GPS in your pocket, the sensors in your car. It lives in the invisible architecture of the modern world. And most of us never think about it. We take it for granted. That planes don't crash in fog. That we can track hurricanes. That ships navigate safely. But none of that was guaranteed. It was built, piece by piece, by engineers and sailors and officers and inventors. People who asked, what if? And then tried. And sometimes failed. And tried again. Until it worked. And when it worked, the world shifted. Not all at once, but gradually. Like dawn spreading across water. That's how change happens. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until one day, you look around and realize everything is different. The sailors at Guadalcanal didn't know they were living through history. They were just trying to survive. Trying to do their jobs. Protect their friends. Make it home. But in doing so, they became part of something larger. A story about human ingenuity. About adaptation. About the relentless march of technology. And that story continues. Right now. As you listen. As you drift. Because the tools we build shape the future. And the future becomes the past. And the past becomes a story. A story we tell, to remember. To learn. To find meaning in the chaos. And maybe to sleep a little easier. Knowing that even in the darkest nights, someone somewhere is watching. With invisible eyes. Keeping us safe. Or at least, trying. And that's enough. For now. So close your eyes. Let the story settle. Let the images fade. The ships. The screens. The sailors. The waves. Let them all drift away. Into the quiet. Into the dark. Where radar beams still sweep. Invisible. Patient. Watching over the water. And over you. As you sleep. Safe. Calm. At peace. Good night.